Yeah, I'm not doing this. Greetings, Starfighters. Vampires. That's what we're doing this season, vampires. Now, if you can get a good look at that cover, you can probably already tell I made a little bit of a mistake. This isn't really cashing in on anything in particular. And in fact, while vampires have never really been not popular, there are peaks and valleys, and we're kind of in a valley right now. The only vampire movie to be released in theaters this year, Hotel Transylvania 3. Well, anywho, you know, it's my fault for not really looking more closely at the cover before I bought it, but here we go. Vampires. And besides, there's some of the Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee Hammer horror films on this, and I've kind of always wanted to see those, but never really got around to it, so no more excuses. I have to do it for the show now. As for the start of this season, we are starting off with a film that is considered a bona fide classic, even by people who don't particularly like vampire movies that much, the 1922 silent film, Nosferatu.
So, now I've watched Nosferatu. Okay, I'm not going to say it like that the whole episode, don't worry. Plot summary? Well, yeah, I know, a movie this famous, why should I even bother? But I'm going to do it anyway. The plot summary is courtesy of all things, the Google.com sidebar in the search results. I tried to find one that I was happier with, but all the ones I found were either too short or too long. Anywho, in this highly influential silent horror film, the mysterious Count Orlok, who is referred to as Dracula in the print of the film I have for some reason, summons Thomas Hutter, called Jonathan Harker in my print, to his remote Transylvanian castle in the mountains. The eerie Orlok seeks to buy a house near Hutter and his wife Ellen, Nina Harker in the print. I guess whoever made this print decided that if it was going to be based on Stoker's Dracula, they should keep the names, but back to the summary. After Orlok reveals his vampire nature, Hutter struggles to escape the castle, knowing that Ellen is in grave danger. Meanwhile, Orlok's servant, Renfield, he's Renfield, we all know he's Renfield, prepares for his master to arrive at his new home. More than any movie in these sets so far, and more than any movie on this set, even The Last Man on Earth, and that one's been on the to-watch list for a while too, I have wanted to see Nosferatu. It might sound a little odd, given how I ragged on all those 80s movies from the previous set, and the one 90s movie. Slightly marginally less so for the two 70s movies, for their problematic elements, that I would be so looking forward to a movie from the 1920s where problematic was more the norm. But while I do think that that's just how things were back then, is generally not an excuse for things that people did know were wrong, even before I was born. You know, keep in mind that America had anti-slavery movements back when this country was still confined mainly to the East Coast and the states were still just colonies. The 1920s and earlier, in terms of cinema, I can be a smidge more lenient on than other past films. Especially the 1980s, because I was born in 82, and I don't really consider anything that happened while I was drawing breath to be ancient history. The 1920s, on the other hand, the medium of cinema, as a whole, was still basically in its infancy. This was the decade when a lot of film techniques, both in terms of presentation and story, were being developed. Things we take for granted, things so commonplace now that D and F film students could do them, were innovative and exciting back then. So yes, even with the rather unfortunate subtext of this movie, although how many of them were intentional is up for debate, I can't help but be as jazzed to finally see this as I was for the Lon Chaney Phantom of the Opera, Metropolis, or even Battleship Potemkin, which is actually a solid film for a piece of propaganda. And that's for real, too, not like with Triumph of the Will, that people actually buy into the idea of Triumph of the Will being innovative, quote-unquote, despite being Nazi propaganda. is itself Nazi propaganda. Probably the most successful piece of Nazi propaganda of all time, as even people who would sooner shoot a Nazi in the genitals than say hello to one will repeat it as a given. That movie is really not all that great. Leni Riefenstahl was not really doing anything innovative. There were movies coming out of Russia like 10, 20 years before then that were doing some of the stuff that was being done in Triumph of the Will. So, yeah, I'm getting way off track here. Let's go to something slightly less evil than Nazis. Vampires. Specifically, the one this movie is about. Now, there was no way I could be as fair to Nosferatu, the film, not the character, as I tried to be with any of the ones before, or as I will try to be with the movies that come next. This movie is one of those that has been, as they say, analyzed to death. I've seen documentaries about the history of film with segments dedicated to it. I've read essays about it. I've seen the Maven of the Eventide and Renegade Cut videos about it. I even saw Shadow of the Vampire before seeing this. I even knew about how the company that made the film basically screwed Bram Stoker's widow on the royalties. So, what can I possibly say without repeating something said by one of my betters, or that doesn't sound like I'm trying too hard to be profound? I mean, I guess I could do what I've always done before on this show and stick largely to my initial reactions to things, only diving in deeper when something particularly strikes me as worth discussing a little more. I mean, hey, I could go into, I mentioned how some of the unfortunate subtext might be unintentional. Like, there is certainly an anti-Semitic read of the film. How valid that is debatable, as the director himself was Jewish. I mean, granted, that doesn't necessarily prove anything. There were Jewish people who initially supported the Nazi Party before the Night of the Long Knives and all that. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep going back to the Nazis here. I really don't. It's kind of weird how often vampires and Nazis just sort of seem to go together. I wonder why that is. But continuing on with those subtexts, that is another case where so much has been said, I don't think I can add to it. I mean, some of these, such as anti-immigrant fears, stuff like that. They're not just in this film, but in much of vampire media across the last 2 centuries as well. So, I'm at a loss there. Not that every vampire story is about immigrants. I know this, you don't need to tell me. I don't get a lot of well-actually posts anyway, but now is not a good time to start. And there will never be a good time to start. So yeah, of the 22 movies I've watched for this show, 23 if you count the Baywatch movie for the bonus episode, Nosferatu is easily in the top 5. And yet, it is probably the movie I have the least to say about. And for fuck's sake, how many times did I mention Nazis in this episode? This movie isn't even about Nazis. This is from 1922. I mean, the people who would go on to become Nazis certainly existed, but I bet the word wasn't being thrown around yet. I mean, I couldn't even really come up with any good jokes for this episode. I'm as disappointed as you are. More so since this is the season premiere. If this were the middle of the set or something, that would probably be less of an issue. Or at least I think so. But, man, just launching off with, yeah, I liked it. Nothing more to say. Dum-da-dum-da-dum. Next movie. Well, time for the random thoughts section. So, I mentioned this back in the plot summary, but, for the record, I have no idea why the print of this film uses the name of the characters from the book when the original film release didn't. Of course, what's embarrassing is that it actually took me a minute to realize that that's what happened. So, at about the 2.5 minute mark of the movie, we see Nina Harker, Ellen Hutt. Oh, let's just stick with Nina Harker. Who are we kidding? We see Nina Harker playing with a cat. If you think I responded to this site by going, kitty, well, you're right and you know me too well. When Jonathan Harker reads in the Book of Vampires the line about men not recognizing dangers that beasts can sense at certain times, I couldn't help but be reminded of those stories that go around social media every once in a while of women whose pets, usually their dogs, hated their dates for no good reason at the time, only to later find out that their date ended up being an abuser. So, good dog. I know this has nothing to do with vampires in general or this movie, but I thought it, and that's what this section is for. And also it was about dogs and dating and not about Nazis. I'm sorry. I shouldn't keep dropping. I'm sorry. I live in America in 2018. Nazis are unfortunately on the brain way more than they should be. While a bit over the top at times, I am fortunate the score accompanying this print of the film is better overall than the music I had to deal with when I watched Phantom of the Opera on Amazon Prime earlier this year. I'm not sure why whoever made that score thought gothy 80s synth pop would be a good fit for a silent movie, but whatever. So, final verdict? Well, you already heard me say that I liked it. You know, for what it is and for when it was made, anyway. Nothing with pacing, writing, acting, or plotting like this would fly in movies made, well, hell, forget today. As little as 10 years later after this movie was made, the medium had already moved forward by leaps and bounds. But I'm glad we have as many movies from the silent era as we do. It truly is a shame that there are so many of these movies that will never be seen again, outside of their original showings at the end of, I was going to say the end of the last century. The end of the last century would be the 1990s, as they were at the end of the 1800s or in the 1910s. And that of all the ones that were saved, one of them was Birth of a Fucking Nation. Seriously, even a lot of people in that time were calling that movie's racism out. But I digress. Well, can I really say I digress when I'm at the end? Really? Doesn't matter. And sorry if my speech seems a little on the disjointed side. It is unseasonably hot for late October. And there's been a little bit of anxiety related to the new seasonal job, which, speaking of that, there will probably only be one more Shameless Cashgrab for this calendar year. Sorry about that, but, my schedule is just bleh. Actually, since this is a vampire set, I should say it like this. It's bleh. I'm sorry. So the next movie, 1974's Count Dracula and His Vampire Bride. And it's one of the Hammer horror films that I mentioned in the intro to this episode. All in all, I'd say this season is off to a fantastic start.